And hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday Live. This is our 13th show, and I'm here with vintage watch expert Louis Westphalen.
It's our third episode together.
This is our third episode together, 13th episode. So you've tuned in at possibly a very inauspicious episode. 13 is not supposed to be lucky.
Bad luck.
Bad luck. So let's see what happens. Let's see if we can get through this without someone's hair catching on fire. All right. Jumping right in, let's take a look at what's on our wrists and what we've got in the safe. I actually have a watch in that I have not seen since Basel World, and I loved it at Basel World, and I'm very happy to see it again. It's the tribute to 50 Fathoms Mil-Spec from Blancpain. Very, very nice size, based on the original 50 Fathoms Mil-Spec from 1957. And the cool thing about this watch is, one of the many cool things about this watch, is that it has that humidity indicator inside. So this is a 300-meter water-resistant watch. Chances are you're never going to actually see this thing turn completely orange. But the idea is that the top half of this orange and white circle will start to turn orange if somehow humidity enters the watch. Yeah. And this was a feature of the original 1957.
Exactly, yeah. Because it would be bad news for the watch.
It would be very bad news. It would be very bad news. And you would want to know.
So what I have, I couldn't resist to bring back the Breitling Colt Sky Racer.
Yep.
I just wrote an article about it.
You certainly did. You certainly did.
With a lot of comments.
Yep.
Definitely. I think it's an interesting. I still think it's an interesting watch.
How many comments did you get on that article?
Above 100.
Over
That's
100.
my new record.
New record. Yeah.
And as you said before, like I guess the fact that it's plastic and quartz, it's kind of like double offense.
Yes. Well, I feel like there are several ways you can get in trouble here on Hodinkee. One of them is to write about a plastic watch, and one of them is to write about a quartz watch. And you wrote about a quartz plastic watch.
But I still maintain what I wrote.
Very brave, very brave of you.
I know.
You know.
I like the criticism.
You knew going into it that it was going to get people riled.
But still, the
you
weight.
You still feel you can defend it.
Definitely.
Okay.
The weight is extremely interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You might like or not the aesthetic.
Yeah.
But the super quartz or the high accuracy quartz is also an interesting feature of the watch.
Yeah.
It's very unusual, I would say. For someone who loves vintage to
I'm not as shocked as some of our readers might have been, because I've seen how you occasionally gravitate towards things that people who know and love Louis Westphalen do not necessarily think Louis Westphalen is going to gravitate towards. So it wasn't a shock per se, but it was still a little bit of a surprise.
But here it is.
Here it is.
And the price point, $2,000, is extremely aggressive if you're thinking about those kind of Swiss brands.
Yeah.
I was looking actually before the episode of comparable price points.
Uh-huh.
You obviously have the Tag Heuer Aqua Racer.
Aqua Racer, yeah.
A couple of Nomos, German, but still. And otherwise, at entry level, you don't have much.
I mean, is there anything else with a temperature compensated, high accuracy quartz movement, and a sort of high tech material case that's at this price point that you can think of offhand?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, the list is fairly short. You have Citizen, Seiko, Omega, ETA that do that.
That's it. Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And again, I think it's important to, one of the things that we learn from stories like this is that everybody has a different sort of ascending and descending chain of values. And while this kind of thing, just because of what it is something that I think a lot of people are going to kind of automatically reject, it's nice to be open-minded and see things that.
And try it.
Yes. Yeah. Try it out. All right.
What you're wearing?
What I'm wearing is, it's another dive watch. It's a Seiko SRP 775, what a lot of folks called the Turtle when it came out, because it resembles the the original Seiko Turtle vintage dive watch. And it's just a great summer watch. I mean, it's a great Friday watch. Very, very comfortable to wear despite the size. Great look. And I'm finding that I'm wearing it more and more, especially over the last few weeks. We've had miserably hot weather in New York, with our fair share of torrential rainstorms that I always somehow seem to be walking out into. I had one this morning on the way into work that left me drenched head to foot.
Good one.
So good day to wear. Not necessary to have a 200-meter dive watch to survive a New York City summer rain shower, but does it hurt? No, it doesn't hurt.
So I'm wearing the opposite of you.
Yeah.
And it's the Piaget 12P from the 1960s in rose gold. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely not something you want to get showered with.
No.
But I just love the aesthetic, how simple it is. It's extremely slim, extremely comfortable, and you were mentioning the kind of Friday vibe.
Yeah,
It's more like a Saturday night dressy vibe.
Right.
I just love it.
Saturday Night Discotheque 1975.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah.
Even before 75.
before.
I think 75 you would have something a bit bigger and a bit bolder, I would say.
So, I mean, that's interesting. Like, the two watches that you've sort of spent the most time with in the last 24 hours, one has been this, big, high-tech, plastic-cased super quartz, and the other is this, supremely elegant, timeless little Piaget 12P.
Yeah, I think that's what makes, watches interesting in general.
Yeah.
It's just like how far they can go and like what you can find in each.
And let's put our hands together for a celebration of diversity of taste.
But now we go the opposite way, right?
Right.
I think what we wanted to look at was the difference between automatic and manual winding.
Yes. So we're going to do another installment of point counterpoint. I will be taking the point. Automatic winding movements are inherently superior, both aesthetically and technically and practically, to manual wind movements. And Louis will be taking the counterpoint.
I'll take the hard one.
The hard one. All right. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that, now let me say at the outset, I happen to love a beautiful manual wind movement. However, if you're comparing them strictly on merits, I think that there is a lot to be said for, in general, preferring a self-winding movement. First of all, a self-winding movement is more practical for obvious reasons. It winds itself. You don't have to do it. Secondly, if you're interested in watch movements as kind of an exercise in connoisseurship, there have been so many different interesting attempts to make self-winding movements. We start off with Breguet and Perrelet, who started making self-winding pocket watches in the mid to late 1700s in the case of Breguet. And then, as you go through time, you see the first series produced automatic watches from Harwood and Rolex's take on the Harwood design. And by the time you get to the mid 20th century, you have some really amazing, and I would argue classically beautiful movements, like the Vacheron 1120/JLC 920.
Yeah.
And right up to the present day, we see incredible, beautifully evolved, technically beautifully evolved movements, like the Rolex caliber 3255, for instance. With the refined escapement geometry, the chronergy escapement, very, very technically forward-thinking movement. We have equally beautiful and interesting movements from Seiko. I think of the Grand Seiko high beat caliber 9S86, for instance. So automatic movements are just a wonderful, wonderful world of inventiveness as well as aesthetics. And even from a chronometry standpoint, I think that you can make an argument that they're inherently superior. An automatically wound movement will tend to maintain a more even power curve than a hand-wound watch, unless it's a hand-wound watch with a very long power reserve. So, unless you're the sort of person who thinks that, medicine started going downhill when Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, maybe an automatic winding movement, really, really is the way to go.
So on that, I disagree.
All right.
Not on penicillin, thank God.
No.
But to me, you're talking about convenience. I'm talking about romance. So I think the relationship that you have with your watch is so much better when you have a manual winding movement, just because every time you give life to your movement. So you could say in an automatic movement, you do give life as well, but it's less of a specific gesture. It's just you doing your business as you do every day. Whereas I feel that the moment that you dedicate to put your watch back to life is really poetic. And I also think that it's reminding you of times where this was a really important, critical instrument of everyone else, whereas now time is everywhere, So if you're talking about just how accurate it is, there are many, many things more accurate than any automatic movement. On the aesthetic, I take your point. I think, it can be made beautifully. Piaget, with the micro rotor is one example. That said, I also feel that often the rotor gets in the way of the movement, kind of hides the view. And so to me, a manual winding movement just shows its beauty directly.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of taken opposing sides for the sake of doing a point counterpoint, but the reality is there are arguments to be made on both sides. I think there's certainly something to be said for the idea of not hiding the beauty of the plates and bridges underneath an automatic winding mechanism, for instance.
Yeah.
And one argument that you sometimes hear against automatic winding watches is that there are more parts to break, there are more things to go wrong, there are more wear issues. Well, you know, you're sort of substituting, I think, especially in a modern self-winding watch with things like ceramic ball bearings, you're really kind of substituting wear in one part of the watch for wear in another part of the watch. Interacting with the crown and with the hand winding mechanism,
Yeah.
you know, produces some wear as well. And as we both know, manipulating the crown by the owner is one of the sort of classic, most common ways to.
You mean like
Yeah.
putting it off?
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess you have to be delicate. That said, I feel that the approach of trying to do the best manual winding movement is really interesting as well. To me, it kind of like peaked in the 1950s, 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Perrelet 260, which was chronometer certified and like
Yes.
only made for that, used by many brands, and including Breguet, for instance. And to me, that's kind of like
Louis, let me
the
ask,
classical watchmaking at its best.
let me ask you a question. We were talking about this before we started the show. Why do you think there is such a dearth, relatively speaking, such a rarity of beautiful full bridge hand wound movements in Switzerland right now? You know, most brands seem to have either partly or entirely gotten out of the business.
I think it's business sense. It's a bit like the date, no date point, you know?
Right.
I would say purists would always say, I don't like the date unless like under very special circumstances. But still, the regular buyer and like the buyer in volume likes to have a watch that has a date, and that's automatic.
Right.
That's convenient.
Right.
And so I think that's the reason.
Especially someone coming from a background of having had quartz watches or never having had a mechanical watch before, they're going to look at a mechanical watch, hand-wound mechanical watch versus an automatic watch, and they're probably going to prefer the automatic, just for convenience.
But I have to say, if you own several watches, if you're lucky in that way, I'm not sure the convenience of an automatic movement is that great, because if you don't wear the watch, mechanically it doesn't rewind itself.
Right.
So I would say for purists, I doubly understand why someone like me would go for hand-wound movements.
Yeah. All right. Now, speaking of hand-wound versus automatic, and we were talking about the sort of question of when both of these things peaked in terms of design and aesthetics. The automatic movement, when the Vacheron 1120/9, JLC 920 first came out in the 1960s, it was the thinnest automatic movement ever, thinnest full rotor automatic movement ever, and it still is. So, we have all of these, beautiful machines from an earlier time, and that's one of the reasons that people are attracted to vintage watches. However, when you enter the vintage watch world, there are some things that it's probably a good idea to look out for. And what Louis is going to do now is he's going to go through 5 basic things that you should think about when you are thinking about buying a vintage watch. And these kind of points to attend to are important factors, pretty much no matter what the vintage watch is, manual winding or automatic. So Louis, you want to break it down for us?
Definitely, yeah. I kind of like thought about it because I feel that the advice you get usually is very general. It's by the seller. It's too good. If it's too good to be true, then it really is. Right. It's all about condition, for instance. And I wanted to go a bit more like into specifics about the watch.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dig a little.
The first thing, it's kind of obvious. It's the dial. It's the face of the watch, so you want that to kind of like look good, but also be correct for the watch. And
so how do you know?
I mean,
or how can you? What do you look at?
I would say comparison is a great starting point, especially on the font, the way the logo is made, the way the chapter ring is made, on chronograph, like how clean it is in the subdials, stuff like that. Obviously, some redials are like incredible and can fool you, but most of the redials that you would see are not that great, and you kind of, I think it's easier to produce a dial in series like beautifully than to make one individually.
Yeah, and in fact, some of the best redials were. This is something that I think maybe you can help clarify for us. It was standard practice to redial watches back when when these were newer things, and this was done with direct participation of the original factory.
Definitely, yeah. They would offer that to you. They would either offer a service dial like Rolex does, or they would offer to redo the dial. And it's also, you have to understand that at the time, like, the waterproofness of the watches were not that great, and you were talking about raining, about getting into a rain showers. Well, then your dial would see the impact of it.
Yeah.
So I think like that's a great starting point, and as always, like asking around people that collect that watch is a good way.
And when you say compare, if you were thinking of buying, especially a high value vintage watch, you would look at the dial of that watch in comparison with another one that you knew for sure to be correct. With several.
Or probably with several. Yeah. Just statistically.
Better safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Yep.
The second thing, it's kind of like coming up more and more. It's about the case. It's case condition. Because I feel sometimes it's a bit overlooked, and on many watches it can really change how the watch looks, how it wears, but also what kind of margin do you have to polish it afterwards. And a couple of examples: the Royal Oak with very specific angles.
Right.
If they are gone, you can say that the spirit of the watch is gone.
Right.
The Oyster Quartz, the Rolex Oyster Quartz is more or less the same thing, like very 70s watches.
So these are two examples of watches with very, very sharp case geometry, and very frequently when we see vintage examples of these exact two watches offered for sale, the case geometry has been obscured to one degree or another by over polishing.
Exactly, or by someone who doesn't really know how to polish such a complicated case as well.
Right.
And then even if you look at all the vintage watches that had very thin lugs, the more and more you polish, the less and less you have material on the lug, and that's an issue. You don't want your lug to break. So I feel again comparison is a good starting point, but also just looking at the ratio of the lug, especially if it's a drilled lug. If you see the hole like really close to the edge, that means that there has been polishing.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and as you have on many vintage watches, where the hole for the spring bar is very, very close to the bottom edge of the case, and it means that somebody's over polished the lug.
Exactly. So that's one way. The second, it's true for like precious metals, but the hallmarks as well. If you see them completely faded or inexistent, then you know that there has been some polishing. And on stainless steel examples, sometimes you also have engravings that can tell you, how deep the polishing had been before.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting point. The third one, and kind of related to engravings, was just about considering the watch as a whole and trying to figure out when it's from. On many watches, you have the serial numbers that help you. You might have the reference number also that gives you kind of a timeline. You have a couple of other clues like the loom material. And I think if you
mean tritium versus radium.
Exactly.
Versus
Because
luminova.
radium is basically until the early 1960s. Tritium is until the late 90s, and luminova and superluminova is from that time.
And as we saw in the episode where we played around with a Geiger counter, if it's a radium dial, radium having a half-life of over 1,000 years, it should set off a Geiger counter.
There is that, and it's also more luminous than an old tritium from the 60s, for instance, just because the half-life is completely different. And I think when you have a watch, let's say from the 70s, and then you see that it's luminova or superluminova on the dial, then you know. You know that something is wrong. Probably the dial was replaced.
So basically, this particular point has to do with establish when the watch was manufactured as closely as possible, and that gives you a lot of other clues as to whether or not what you're looking at is actually correct.
Yeah, and sometimes on the Rolexes, for instance, on the clasp, you have a code for the date. And so if you know what time, around what period your watch was made, and if you know the code on the clasp, you can figure out whether
And the two should match, obviously, if the bracelet is original.
Or like 1-2 years, but not more.
All right. next point is I think it's my favorite of the 5.
Yeah, so this one sounds obvious, but I think if you do the first 3, you might overlook the 4th. Because sometimes you're so focused on the small details that you forget the most important, which is, does the movement work?
Right.
And it's something where, on vintage, it's not a crucial point, or it's not the first point you ask, but then what it means is significant, because a service can be expensive, but sometimes it can be impossible as well.
Yeah, especially with complicated vintage watches. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of vintage chronograph calibers, for example, which haven't been manufactured in decades, and parts are a big concern.
Yeah.
And the further back you go, the bigger a problem.
Exactly.
Is. And we've seen many instances, you and I, watches that look beautiful cosmetically, beautiful case, beautiful dial. You open up the back, and the movement is it's in bad shape. There's rust damage, corrosion that really can't be fixed, and the watch is kind of sort of running. So if you weren't thinking closely about functionality, you wouldn't necessarily say to yourself, well, no, this one's not for me, but it's really a watch, it's sort of a ticking time bomb.
True. And that's why you should ask for the movement shot if you can, or if the seller has the capacity to.
Yeah.
And then it gives you clues. You also have, I think it ties to the fifth point, which is ask questions. Honestly, it's because you want to know as much as possible before buying.
Right.
And for instance, I remember one watch I bought on eBay. The pictures were really great. Nothing bad about it.
Already doesn't sound like eBay if the pictures were great.
Yeah, maybe that was the clue. But then I received the watch. I turned the hand, and one stain on the dial had been hidden under, one of the minute hand actually.
So you think the seller did this deliberately? Positioned the minute hand in the photographs to hide a blemish on the dial?
I mean, what are the odds?
Yeah.
And so. For that,
Sneaky.
I think asking additional questions, asking additional pictures is fair, and a good way to make sure that the watch, is as you think, but also that the watch actually belongs to the seller. Because I've also seen listings with stolen pictures, and then you pay and you never get the watch because there was no watch to begin with.
I mean, I've had unpleasant surprises too. I remember when I was first started out, I was mostly collecting American railroad grade pocket watches, and this was kind of a, if it's too good to be true, it probably is situation. The watch was not terribly expensive for what it was, a Hamilton 950E, which is one of the most beautiful sort of railroad grade chronometer pocket watches made in the United States by Hamilton. And the movement looked great in pictures, but when I got the watch and I decased the movement, somehow water had gotten underneath the dial, and the dial side of the movement actually showed considerable amount of corrosion, which was heartbreaking. Yeah. Because I thought what I was getting was a beautiful movement. All right.
Talking about technical stuff?
Talking about tactical stuff. We've had quite a few requests from viewers looking at, asking us to look at some of our favorite watch books. And there's hundreds of watch books out there. And we love many of them. A few of, I'm going to start off with one of my favorites, which I think it's kind of an obvious one, Watchmaking by Dr. George Daniels. Now, this is really a manual on how to make a watch, and like most technical manuals, it can be a little bit dry, but there are times when Dr. Daniels kind of lets himself go a little bit, and you see a flash of his kind of very English sense of humor. Writing about the duplex escapement, there's a variation called the Chinese duplex because it was used in Chinese market watches, and he wrote, a characteristic of the Chinese duplex is that the second hand advances once per second. It's kind of a natural deadbeat escapement watch. So Daniels wrote, "This system was once held in high esteem by the Chinese, who despised crawling seconds hands on their watches. Such escapements are bad timekeepers, but doubtless the Chinese had sufficient tranquility of mind to not be concerned." So this is, the notion of China as a land of inherent serenity, I think.
Mine is slightly different. The first book I really love, it's actually an autobiography from Jack Hoyer, so from the Hoyer brand.
Oh, sure.
And I think it's fascinating because he went from the golden period to the worst period. He actually lost the company that bore his name and the name of his family. And still he bounced back, and now is like the honorary chairman of Tag Heuer. And I think there is a lot of lessons in leadership, in the fact of like never giving up, I would say. And one of my favorite quote from him is probably at the exact middle of the book, at the exact middle of his life. And it was 5 months away from my 50th anniversary, and I was ruined. I realized I would have to start a new professional life from scratch. And this was, after losing the brand, basically.
Yeah. I think we'll do one more book.
Yeah, sure.
One of my favorite watch books. I'm just going to, give this guy a plug, even though the book was written in 1970. It's a book by a guy named Kenneth Olliott, and despite the fact that I've been enjoying this particular book for many, many years, I don't really know that much about him. I've never seen a biography of him, but he wrote a beautiful, charming little book on watch collecting. The book is called Watch Collecting, and it's just chock full of wonderful observations about the sort of human side of watch collecting, about what watchmakers were like as people. You know, there's one place where he observes that Ferdinand Berthoud had a very high opinion of his own work. You know, observations that really lend a sort of. We good? Oh, great. Okay. Sorry about that little brief technical glitch. There's a quote in this particular book that I think really sums up a lot of the whole atmosphere around watch collecting and what. How about now? We good? All right. Sorry about that little technical glitch. We are back. Told you it was number. Am I holding this right? 13. Unlucky number 13. What was I saying? Oh, Kenneth Thalgate. Yeah, there's this. My favorite quote in the book is, and I think it's a beautiful characterization of watch connoisseurs, watch enthusiasts. He writes in a discussion of John Arnold and who invented the lever escapement, a detailed diary from John Arnold would have settled many of the continuing arguments about the originator of the lever escapement, albeit many keen horologists would have been denied the pleasure of getting angry with each other.
That's a nice one.
That's a good one.
Mine would be from The Mastery of Time. It's a really big book. It goes through the entire history of not only watchmaking, but like timekeeping, what time means and like how people have been tracking it. And I think there is a quote, not really from the book, but from the Foreword. The guy who wrote the Foreword is, you know him, it's Franco Colloni.
Oh, sure.
Who has written many other books. And he says, "It's in the nature of mankind to submit to virtue and knowledge. To follow the path of knowledge is to escape from barbarism. And it is certain that the evolution of timepieces has accompanied and even advanced the history of civilization. In my opinion, there is another vital ingredient, passion." And I think that's kind of like summing up, you know, what watch collecting is. Yeah. That's a beautiful quote. I actually had never read that before. Maybe I should read the prefaces to books a little more often. Sometimes it pays off. Yeah. All right. Well, if you're still with us, thank you for staying with us through that little technical glitch. We're going to go now to reader questions, and I think actually the first one I'm looking at is kind of an interesting one. What are your thoughts and feelings on the new 43 millimeter Rolex Sea Dweller, Louis?
I've seen it.
Which we've covered quite a bit, but I think there's room for revisiting this.
I've seen it, I've tried it, and I really like it. I like the way it wears, I like the way it looks.
Mm-hmm.
I was not convinced when I heard what it was on paper, and I think they've done a wonderful job. Again, you know, we're talking about big diameters.
Yeah.
But, you know, 43 millimeter is also what some people wanted. And it allows Rolex to have a product that's in between the classical Submariner and the way more toolish deep sea Sea Dweller.
Right. It's really it's a characteristically Rolex exercise in over-engineering, which to me is part of the appeal. I mean, you know, nobody needs a a dive watch that's water resistant to 200 meters, really, or 500 meters or 1,000 meters. But there's something inherently fascinating, as Jason Heaton pointed out, in a story that he did for us recently on dive watch myths, which is a great piece that I encourage you to read if you haven't. There's just something inherently interesting about the over-engineering that goes into dive watches, the fact that they can do things that they will probably never be called on to do, but that they could do them if you wanted them to, is kind of interesting. It's like, the person who buys a Bugatti Veyron and is never going to drive it faster than 100 miles an hour. It's still fun to know that you're in a car that can do, over 200 miles an hour, 250 miles an hour, and has 1,000 plus horsepower under the hood. It's an exercise in extremes, kind of. I don't want to say extremes for their own sake.
Performance.
Yeah, performance. That's right. That's right. Performance study. Here's another one about Rolex. What happened to the day date? Seems that when I see reports of watch get-togethers events, I see very few day dates. Has it lost some of its cachet?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
It's an obvious choice.
Yeah.
I feel maybe it's kind of like a daily wear for people, and when they go.
There are fads always in what people are most inclined to talk about, and we kind of go through these, collective bursts of mania in the watch community about different things. But I think it's a timeless classic, and it has been for many, many years, and I think it's going to continue on in that way. Let's see what else. When do you consider? Okay, Louis, here's one for you. This has you written all over it. We're going to do one more. Where do you consider the year changed from vintage to contemporary watches? So what is vintage?
Okay, that's a big question. I think giving a specific year is going to be tough. Before it used to be kind of like considering a 20-year timeline. That said, now you're almost going into like late 90s, and that's not vintage. I think one of the best way to describe the difference between vintage and modern is actually whether it has a plexi or a sapphire crystal. Because
plexiglass or sapphire.
Exactly. Just because the way the light hits the dial is very different, and I think it's also, the sapphire is also better in the long term, I would say. But that's kind of like the charm of vintage versus the cold efficiency of modern, I would say. And so in terms of placing when it happens, obviously it's not true for all brands and stuff like that, but you would think, late 80s for the change, for the transition. So that's kind of the cutoff.
When did Rolex start using synthetic sapphire instead of plexiglass in sports watches?
So basically the 70s, early 70s on their Beta 21, what we call the Texano, reference 5100. But when it became kind of like standard practice is more the 80s, and it arrived on the Submariner. So I would say that's the cutoff for Rolex. Interestingly, Tudor belongs to Rolex, and still you have Tudors from the 90s still with a plexiglass.
Interesting. All right, that's the show for this week. Thank you all for sticking with us, and those of you who noted in the comments that we might need a little luck with episode number 13, how very prescient you were. We had a little bit of a technical glitch, but hopefully you enjoyed the show. And Louis, thank you as always for sharing your incredible depth of knowledge with us, and we'll see you next time.